What happens when three men think they've found an easy target in a quiet coffee shop? What they don't know is that the woman sitting alone, reading her book and sipping her latte, has survived Taliban ambushes, completed missions that most men couldn't handle, and earned a reputation that makes hardened soldiers respect her with just a glance. This is the story of Sarah Martinez, a decorated Navy SEAL who thought her most dangerous days were behind her. She was wrong. Sometimes the greatest battles happen not in foreign lands, but in the most ordinary places, when evil people make the fatal mistake of judging someone by their appearance. When those three men decided to strike her in the face, they had no idea they were about to discover why assaulting a Navy SEAL is the last mistake some people ever make. Sarah Martinez had never imagined that retirement from the Navy SEALs would feel so strange. After 15 years of serving her country in the most dangerous missions across Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified operations in places she couldn't even name, the quiet streets of Portland, Oregon seemed almost surreal. At 38, she had earned her rest, but her body and mind were still those of a warrior, trained to detect threats and respond with lethal precision. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of Riverside Coffee, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. Sarah sat at her usual corner table, the one that gave her a clear view of all entrances and exits. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits had kept her alive through countless life-or-death situations. She wore simple civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain grey sweater, and worn leather boots. To anyone looking, she appeared to be just another customer enjoying her morning coffee and a paperback novel. But appearances could be deceiving. Beneath her relaxed exterior, Sarah remained alert. Her dark eyes, which had seen too much violence and loss, constantly scanned the room. Her hands, scarred from explosions and combat, rested casually on the table. But her muscles were always ready to spring into action. This awareness wasn't paranoia. It was survival instinct honed by years of training and real-world experience where a moment's inattention meant death. Sarah had moved to Portland 6 months ago, seeking anonymity and peace. She had bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, far from the chaos of military bases and the constant tension of special operations. Her savings, combined with her military pension, gave her the freedom to live simply. She spent her days reading, hiking in the beautiful Oregon forests, and slowly learning how to be a civilian again. The transition hadn't been easy. For months after leaving the Navy, she had struggled with nightmares and anxiety. The sound of car backfiring would send her diving for cover. Crowded places made her nervous. But gradually, with the help of therapy and her own determination, she was finding her way back to a normal life. The coffee shop had become her sanctuary, a place where she could practice being around people without the weight of a weapon on her hip or the constant threat of enemy fire. Dr. Rebecca Chen, her therapist, had encouraged her to find routines that helped her feel grounded in civilian life. "You need to create new patterns," Dr. Rebecca Chen had explained during one of their sessions. "Your brain is wired for constant vigilance. We need to teach it that not every situation is a potential threat." The coffee shop routine was part of that healing process. Sarah opened her book, a mystery novel she had picked up at the local bookstore. Reading fiction was another new experience for her. During her military years, her reading had been limited to intelligence briefings, tactical manuals, and mission reports. Now she found herself enjoying the escape that stories provided, the way they could transport her mind away from the memories of war. As she read, she remained peripherally aware of the other customers. There was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who came in every Tuesday and Thursday for her decaf and blueberry muffin. Behind the counter, Jake, the 20-something barista with a philosophy degree, was expertly crafting drinks while discussing Nietzsche with a customer. Near the window, 2 college students were studying for what appeared to be an economics exam, their textbooks spread across their table like battle plans. It was the kind of peaceful, ordinary scene that Sarah had once thought she would never be able to enjoy. During her darkest moments in Afghanistan, when her unit was pinned down by enemy fire and survival seemed uncertain, she had dreamed of quiet coffee shops and normal life. Now that she had it, she was learning to appreciate these simple moments of peace. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger brother Miguel, who was still active duty Army stationed in Germany. "How's civilian life treating you, sis? Still reading those romance novels?" She smiled and typed back, "Mystery novels, actually. And civilian life is quiet. Sometimes too quiet." It was true. After years of adrenaline-fueled missions, the calm of ordinary life sometimes felt almost overwhelming in its gentleness. Sarah had been one of the first women to successfully complete SEAL training when the program opened to women. The training had been brutal. Months of physical and mental torture designed to weed out all but the strongest and most determined candidates. Out of her class of 200 hopefuls, only 12 had graduated, and she had been the only woman. The achievement had made her something of a celebrity within military circles, but she had always preferred to let her actions speak rather than her gender. Her military record was impressive by any standard. She had completed over 60 combat missions, earned 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and numerous other commendations. She had been part of the team that rescued hostages from a terrorist compound in Syria, had gathered intelligence that prevented several terrorist attacks on American soil, and had trained foreign military units in counter-terrorism tactics. Her commanding officers had described her as one of the finest soldiers they had ever worked with, male or female. But the cost of that service had been high. She had seen friends die in her arms, had been forced to take lives in combat, and had carried the weight of decisions that meant the difference between mission success and failure. The stress had ended her marriage to David, her fellow soldier who couldn't handle the secrecy and danger of her work. They had divorced 3 years ago, and while it had been amicable, it had left her feeling more isolated than ever. The physical scars were easier to deal with than the emotional ones. Her body bore the evidence of her service, a scar along her left arm from shrapnel, another on her shoulder from a knife wound, and countless smaller marks from training and combat. But these visible reminders of her past were nothing compared to the invisible wounds that therapy was helping her address. As she turned the page of her book, Sarah noticed 3 men entering the coffee shop. Something about them immediately triggered her trained instincts. They moved with the swagger of men looking for trouble, their eyes scanning the room in a way that suggested they were sizing up potential targets rather than looking for a place to sit. One was tall and heavily built, with tattoos covering his arms and a shaved head. The second was shorter but equally muscular, with a beard and hostile eyes. The third appeared younger, maybe in his 20s, with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself. They ordered coffee but didn't sit down. Instead, they remained standing near the counter, talking in low voices and occasionally glancing around the room. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She noted the exits, assessed potential weapons in the room, and began calculating tactical options. It was an unconscious response, like breathing or blinking. Even though she was trying to live a normal civilian life, her warrior instincts remained sharp and ready. The men's behavior became more concerning as the minutes passed. They weren't drinking their coffee or engaging in normal conversation. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something or someone. The tall one kept checking his phone, while the bearded one was paying particular attention to the female customers in the shop. Sarah noticed him looking at the college students with an expression that made her skin crawl. Her book remained open in front of her, but she was no longer reading. Every sense was alert now, cataloging details and preparing for action. The weight of the tactical knife she still carried in her boot was reassuring, though she hoped she would never need to use it again. Her hands remained relaxed on the table, but her muscles were coiled and ready. The atmosphere in the coffee shop began to shift subtly. Other customers seemed to sense the tension, even if they couldn't identify its source. Conversations became quieter, and people began glancing nervously at the 3 men. Mrs. Henderson finished her muffin quickly and gathered her purse, clearly uncomfortable. The college students packed up their books and left without finishing their drinks. Sarah remained in her seat, outwardly calm, but inwardly preparing for whatever was about to happen. She had learned long ago that some fights chose you, regardless of whether you wanted them or not. As a SEAL, she had sworn an oath to protect innocent people, and that oath didn't end just because she had retired. If these men were planning to hurt someone, they would discover that they had picked the wrong coffee shop on the wrong day. The young barista, Jake, seemed oblivious to the growing tension. He continued making drinks and chatting with customers, his philosophy degree apparently not including courses on reading dangerous situations. Sarah made a mental note to position herself between him and the potential threats if things went bad. As she pretended to read, Sarah reflected on how different her life had become. 6 months ago, she had been leading reconnaissance missions in hostile territory, where danger was expected and prepared for. Now she was sitting in a peaceful coffee shop in Portland, trying to enjoy a quiet morning with a book. But trouble had a way of finding her, no matter how far she ran from it. The 3 men finished their coffee and moved toward the seating area. The tall one sat at a table near the window, while the other 2 positioned themselves in different parts of the room. It was a tactical formation, Sarah realized. They were setting up fields of fire and blocking escape routes. This wasn't random. They were planning something, and they had chosen their positions with military precision. Sarah's heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled. Years of training had taught her to manage her body's stress response, to think clearly under pressure. Whatever was about to happen, she would be ready for it. She thought about the peaceful life she had been trying to build, the therapy sessions, and the quiet mornings and the simple pleasure of reading mystery novels. All of that might be about to end, but she didn't hesitate. Some things were more important than personal peace. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, and the coffee shop maintained its facade of normalcy. But Sarah Martinez, retired Navy SEAL, sat ready for battle in her corner booth, her book open, and her warrior's heart prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect innocent people from the evil that had just walked through the door. The three men had been in position for nearly 20 minutes when their true intentions became clear. Sarah watched as the tall one, who seemed to be their leader, made eye contact with his companions and nodded slightly. It was a signal she recognized from her military experience, the go-ahead for whatever operation they had planned. Her grip tightened imperceptibly on her coffee cup as she prepared for action. The target of their attention became obvious when a young woman entered the coffee shop. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with long blonde hair and the kind of innocent beauty that unfortunately attracted predators. She wore expensive clothes and carried a designer purse that suggested she came from money. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what was happening. These weren't random troublemakers. They were predators who had been waiting for a specific type of victim. The young woman, completely unaware of the danger, approached the counter and ordered a complicated drink, some kind of caramel macchiato with extra foam. She seemed nervous about something, checking her phone repeatedly and glancing toward the door as if she was expecting someone. Sarah noticed she was wearing a college ID badge from Portland State University, probably a student meeting someone for a study session or date. Jake, the barista, chatted with her while preparing her drink. "First time trying our caramel macchiato?" he asked with his usual friendly smile. The young woman nodded and smiled back nervously. "My friend recommended it. She said it's amazing here." Sarah noted that the woman mentioned meeting a friend, someone who might be arriving soon and could potentially become another victim. The tall man stood up from his table and began moving slowly toward the counter, timing his approach to intercept the young woman when she turned around with her drink. His companions remained seated but alert, ready to block any escape routes. Sarah recognized the tactics immediately. It was a coordinated hunting pattern designed to isolate and control a target with minimal resistance. Sarah's training kicked into full gear. She had spent years learning to read hostile intentions and respond with appropriate force. These men were clearly experienced predators, probably with a history of targeting vulnerable women in public places. The way they moved, their positioning, their timing, it all indicated they had done this before. They were confident, methodical, and dangerous. The young woman received her drink and turned to find a seat, walking directly toward the tall man's position. Sarah watched as he prepared to accidentally bump into her, probably spilling her hot drink and creating an excuse to help clean up, establish physical contact, and begin the process of manipulation and control. It was a classic predator move that Sarah had studied in her anti-terrorism training. Time slowed down as Sarah calculated her options. She could intervene directly, but that might escalate the situation and put other innocent people at risk. She could try to warn the young woman, but the men might adapt their plan or simply leave and wait for another opportunity. She could call the police, but they would arrive too late to prevent whatever was about to happen. The tall man stepped forward just as the young woman passed his table. "Oh, excuse me," he said loudly as he deliberately bumped into her, causing her drink to splash onto her white blouse. The hot liquid made her gasp and step backward directly into the path of the second man who had quietly moved up behind her. "I'm so sorry about that," the tall man continued, his voice oozing false concern. "Let me help you clean that up." He reached for napkins while his companion placed a supposedly steadying hand on her shoulder. To anyone not trained to recognize predatory behavior, it would look like a simple accident and helpful strangers offering assistance. But Sarah saw it for what it was, the beginning of a coordinated assault. The men were using classic manipulation tactics to establish physical contact and control. The next step would be to convince the young woman to go somewhere more private to clean up properly, perhaps to a bathroom or outside where they could complete their attack without witnesses. "That's really not necessary," the young woman said. Clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention, she tried to step away but found her path blocked by the second man. "I can handle it myself." Her voice carried a note of growing alarm as she began to realize something was wrong. "Come on, don't be like that," the bearded man said, his grip on her shoulder tightening. "We're just trying to help. There's a bathroom in the back where you can clean up properly." His tone had changed from helpful to demanding, and Sarah saw the young woman's eyes widen with fear as she understood her situation. The third man, the youngest one, had moved to block the exit while pretending to browse the bulletin board near the door. It was a textbook containment strategy, and Sarah knew that within the next 60 seconds, these men would either convince their victim to go with them voluntarily or resort to more direct methods of coercion. Sarah made her decision. She had sworn an oath as a Navy SEAL to protect innocent people, and that oath didn't have an expiration date. Rising from her table with fluid grace, she walked toward the group, her demeanor casual but her every sense alert for sudden movement or hidden weapons. "Excuse me," she said in a friendly voice, addressing the young woman directly. "Aren't you Emma from my book club? I thought I recognized you." It was a complete lie, but it gave her a reason to approach and potentially provide an escape route for the victim. The tall man's eyes snapped to Sarah, and she saw calculation and annoyance there. This wasn't part of their plan, and they were deciding how to handle the unexpected interference. "Sorry, lady," he said with forced politeness. "We've got this handled. Our friend here just needs to clean up." "Oh, I can help with that," Sarah continued, maintaining her friendly facade while positioning herself strategically. "The bathroom here can be tricky to find." "Emma, why don't I show you where it is?" She offered her arm to the young woman, who looked desperately grateful for the intervention. The bearded man's grip on the young woman's shoulder tightened. "Like my friend said, we've got this covered. You can go back to your book." His tone carried a clear threat, and Sarah saw his free hand move towards his jacket pocket. She made note of the potential weapon while maintaining her pleasant expression. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said, her voice still friendly but carrying an undertone that any experienced fighter would recognize as a warning. "But I think Emma would be more comfortable with another woman helping her." She looked directly into the tall man's eyes, letting him see something there that made him reconsider his assumptions about the quiet woman from the corner table. The young woman, sensing an opportunity, tried to move towards Sarah. "Actually, yes, I would appreciate that," she said quickly. But the bearded man's grip prevented her from moving, and Sarah saw his other hand emerge from his jacket pocket, holding what appeared to be a small knife.
"I said we've got this handled," the tall man repeated, his voice dropping its pretense of politeness.
"Walk away, lady, before you get hurt." He took a step towards Sarah, clearly intending to intimidate her into backing down. Behind him, his youngest companion had turned from the door and was moving closer, ready to provide backup. Sarah remained perfectly still, her body language appearing non-threatening while actually being coiled for explosive action. "I don't think so," she said quietly, her voice carrying a steel that made all three men pause. "I think the young lady would like to leave with me, right now." The confrontation had reached a tipping point. The coffee shop had emptied except for Jake behind the counter, who was frozen with uncertainty about what to do. The three predators found themselves facing an unexpected obstacle to their carefully planned operation, and Sarah could see them weighing their options. They could abandon their current victim and wait for another opportunity. But they had invested time and energy in this particular target. They could try to intimidate Sarah into leaving, but something in her demeanor suggested she wouldn't be easily scared off. Or they could escalate to violence, but that would create witnesses and complications they probably wanted to avoid. Sarah watched their body language carefully, reading their intentions like a book. The tall man was the decision-maker, but he was also the most cautious. The bearded one was aggressive and impatient, more likely to resort to violence quickly. The young one was nervous and unpredictable, which made him potentially the most dangerous in a fluid situation. "You're making a mistake," the tall man said finally, his voice carrying genuine menace now. "You should have minded your own business." His hand moved toward his jacket, and Sarah tensed for action. The careful facade of civilized interaction was about to shatter into violence. The young woman whimpered, as the bearded man's grip tightened painfully on her shoulder. "Please," she whispered, "I just want to go home." Her fear was palpable, and Sarah felt the familiar cold fury that had carried her through countless combat situations. These men had made a fundamental miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a normal civilian who would be intimidated by their threats and aggression. "Let her go," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying absolute authority. "This ends here." She took a step forward, and something in her movement made all three men instinctively step back. It was a predator's recognition of a superior predator, the kind of deep animal awareness that transcends conscious thought. The tall man's hand completed its journey to his jacket, and Sarah saw the outline of a weapon there. Her own hand moved with lightning speed to the tactical knife in her boot, though she didn't draw it yet. The message was clear. If this escalated to weapons, she was ready. "Last chance," Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet now. "Walk away, right now." Behind her casual words was the promise of overwhelming violence if her warning was ignored. Years of combat experience had taught her to project lethal capability without actually demonstrating it, to give opponents one final opportunity to make the smart choice. But these men had spent too long as successful predators to back down from what they still saw as a lone woman. They had no idea that they were facing someone who had killed trained enemy soldiers in close combat, someone who had survived firefights that would have broken lesser warriors. Their mistake was about to become fatal. The tension in the coffee shop had reached a breaking point when the tall man made his fatal decision. Instead of heeding Sarah's warning and walking away, he chose to escalate. His hand emerged from his jacket holding a switchblade, the metal gleaming under the coffee shop's warm lighting. "You should have minded your own business, bitch," he snarled, taking a step towards Sarah. It was the last mistake he would ever make. What happened next occurred so quickly that Jake, the barista, would later tell police he wasn't sure exactly what he had witnessed. One moment, the tall man was advancing with a knife, confident in his ability to intimidate or harm a lone woman. The next moment, he was on the floor, unconscious, his weapon spinning across the tile floor toward the counter. Sarah had moved with the fluid precision of years of training and combat experience. As the knife came toward her, she stepped inside the arc of the attack, her left hand deflecting his wrist while her right delivered a devastating strike to his solar plexus. The blow was perfectly placed and timed, designed to incapacitate without killing. The man dropped like a stone, his body shutting down from the precision trauma. The bearded man, still gripping the young woman's shoulder, had barely processed what happened to his leader when Sarah was already turning toward him. His hand fumbled for his own weapon, but Sarah was operating on a different level now. The careful control she had maintained while trying to de-escalate was gone, replaced by the lethal efficiency that had made her one of the Navy's most decorated special operators. "Run," Sarah commanded the young woman, her voice carrying absolute authority. The student didn't need to be told twice. She broke free from the bearded man's suddenly loosened grip and bolted toward the exit, her expensive coffee forgotten on the floor. The bearded man cursed and pulled a knife from his belt, a larger blade than his unconscious leader had carried. "You crazy bitch!" he shouted, lunging towards Sarah with the wild aggression of someone used to intimidating victims but not accustomed to facing real opposition. Sarah sidestepped his clumsy attack with contemptuous ease. These men might be successful predators against innocent civilians, but they had no training in real combat. They relied on intimidation, surprise, and overwhelming helpless victims. Against someone with Sarah's background, they were worse than amateurs. They were walking targets. Her counterattack was swift and brutal. She grabbed the bearded man's wrist and twisted, applying a joint lock that sent waves of agony through his arm and forced him to drop his weapon. Before he could react, her knee drove upward into his ribs with bone-crushing force. The sound of breaking ribs was audible throughout the coffee shop, followed by his scream of pain as he doubled over. Sarah didn't stop there. Her elbow came down on the back of his neck with precisely controlled force, enough to render him unconscious without causing permanent damage. He crumpled to the floor beside his leader. Both men neutralized within seconds of their decision to escalate to violence. The youngest member of their group, who had been blocking the exit, stared in shock at his fallen companions. His nervous energy had transformed into genuine terror as he watched a woman he had assumed would be easy to intimidate systematically destroy his more experienced partners. His hand shook as he reached for his own weapon, a cheap pistol that he clearly had little experience with. "Don't," Sarah said simply, turning to face him. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but her eyes held the cold promise of death. "You're young. You can still walk away from this and make better choices with your life." She took a slow step toward him. Her hands relaxed at her sides, but ready to move with lethal speed. The young man's weapon wavered as he tried to decide whether to shoot or run. Fear and adrenaline were clouding his judgment, making his hands shake and his breathing rapid. Sarah could see that he was on the edge of panic, which made him unpredictable and therefore more dangerous than his unconscious companions. "You killed them!" he accused, his voice cracking with stress. The pistol in his hand jerked wildly as he spoke, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. "You're some kind of psycho." "They're not dead," Sarah said calmly, keeping her voice level and non-threatening despite being ready to move instantly if he raised the weapon. "They're unconscious. They'll wake up with some pain and embarrassment, but they'll live. You can too, if you make the smart choice right now." Behind the counter, Jake had recovered enough from his shock to call 911. Sarah could hear him giving the address to the emergency operator, his voice shaking but clear. The police would arrive soon, but not soon enough to prevent further violence if this situation continued to escalate. Put the gun down, Sarah continued, taking another slow step forward. You don't want to spend the rest of your life in prison for murder. And you definitely don't want to find out what happens if you point that weapon at me. The warning in her voice was unmistakable, the promise of a predator who had moved beyond the realm of restraint. The young man's weapon hand continued to shake, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Stay back," he shouted, finally raising the pistol to point it in Sarah's general direction. "I'll shoot. I swear I'll shoot." Sarah evaluated the situation with the cold calculation of a trained warrior. The young man was holding the weapon incorrectly, his stance was all wrong, and his emotional state was compromised by fear and adrenaline. Even if he pulled the trigger, his chances of hitting her were minimal. But there were other considerations. Jake was still behind the counter, there were windows that could be shattered by stray bullets, and even a panicking amateur with a gun could get lucky. "Okay," she said, raising her hands slightly in a gesture of apparent surrender. "I'm not moving any closer, just calm down and think about this." But even as she spoke, she was calculating angles and distances, preparing for the move that would end this confrontation with minimal risk to innocent bystanders. The young man seemed to relax slightly at her apparent compliance, but his weapon remained pointed in her direction. "That's right," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You just stay right there until my boys wake up, and then we're all walking out of here." Sarah almost felt sorry for him. He still didn't understand what he was dealing with, still thought this was a situation he could control. Years of facing truly dangerous enemies, trained terrorists, experienced soldiers, fanatics willing to die for their cause, had given her a perspective that made civilian criminals seem almost pathetic in comparison. "Your boys aren't waking up anytime soon," she said matter-of-factly, "and the police will be here in a few minutes. This is your last chance to walk away and start over somewhere else. Don't throw your life away because you got mixed up with the wrong people." But the young man had passed the point of rational decision-making. Fear had taken over, and in his panicked state, he saw only two options: use the weapon or be captured. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Sarah saw the telltale muscle tension that indicated he was about to fire. She moved before he could complete the action, her body exploding into motion with the speed and precision that had kept her alive through countless firefights. The distance between them disappeared in a heartbeat as she closed the gap, her hand striking his wrist with surgical precision while simultaneously spinning him around and away from any potential bystanders. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, the bullet embedding itself in acoustic tile instead of human flesh. Before the young man could recover from the shock of the gunshot, Sarah had disarmed him and applied a chokehold that cut off the blood flow to his brain. He struggled for a few seconds before losing consciousness, joining his companions on the coffee shop floor. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes from start to finish. 3 armed predators who had entered the coffee shop confident in their ability to control and terrorize innocent people now lay unconscious, defeated by a woman they had dismissed as an easy target. Sarah stood among the fallen criminals, her breathing steady and her heart rate already returning to normal. The tactical mindset that had carried her through the fight was giving way to the more complex emotions of someone trying to build a peaceful civilian life. She had hoped never to use these skills again, had dreamed of quiet mornings and mystery novels instead of violence and conflict. Jake emerged from behind the counter, his face pale with shock. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, are you hurt? I called the police. They should be here any minute." Sarah looked around the coffee shop that had been her refuge, seeing the overturned chairs and scattered coffee cups that marked the battlefield. Blood from the bearded man's broken ribs stained the floor near her usual reading table. The peaceful sanctuary where she had been learning to live without constant vigilance was now a crime scene. "I'm fine," she said simply, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. The careful progress she had made in therapy, the slow healing from years of combat trauma, had been set back by the necessity of violence once again. But she felt no regret for her actions. Protecting innocent people was worth any personal cost. The sound of sirens in the distance announced the approaching police response. Soon the coffee shop would be filled with officers, paramedics, and investigators. There would be questions, reports, and probably media attention once word got out about what had happened. Her quiet, anonymous life in Portland was about to become much more complicated. As she waited for the authorities to arrive, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. She had tried to leave her warrior past behind, but it seemed determined to follow her wherever she went. Perhaps some people were simply meant to stand between evil and innocence, regardless of the personal cost. Perhaps finding peace didn't mean avoiding all conflict, but rather choosing which conflicts were worth fighting. The first police officers to arrive at Riverside Coffee found a scene that initially made no sense to them. 3 men lay unconscious on the floor, weapons scattered nearby, while a calm woman in civilian clothes sat at a corner table answering questions from the traumatized barista. The evidence of violence was clear, but the apparent victim was unharmed and eerily composed. Detective Maria Santos was the first investigator on scene, a 20-year veteran of the Portland Police Department who had seen every variety of criminal behavior the city had to offer. But as she surveyed the coffee shop, she found herself puzzled by the scene. The 3 unconscious men were known to her department: Marcus Webb, Tony Rodriguez, and Kevin Chen, all with extensive criminal records involving assault, robbery, and sexual assault. They were dangerous predators who typically operated as a team to target vulnerable women. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Santos," she said, approaching Sarah with the careful politeness police used with potential witnesses. "I understand you were involved in this incident. Can you tell me what happened here?" Sarah provided a clear, factual account of the events, her military training evident in the precise way she recalled details and timelines. She described the men's suspicious behavior, their coordination in positioning themselves around the coffee shop, and their targeting of the young college student. Her description of the confrontation was methodical and professional, lacking the emotional trauma typical of civilian crime victims. As Sarah spoke, Detective Santos found herself increasingly intrigued by this witness, who showed no signs of shock or distress despite having just engaged in hand-to-hand combat with 3 armed criminals. There was something about the woman's bearing and manner of speaking that reminded Santos of the military veterans she occasionally encountered in her work. "Miss Martinez," Santos said, consulting her notes. "Can you tell me about your background? It's unusual for civilians to be able to handle armed assailants so effectively." The question was posed professionally, but Santos was clearly trying to understand how a seemingly ordinary woman had managed to single-handedly defeat 3 dangerous criminals. Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that her answer would change everything about how this incident would be perceived and reported. Her military service was a matter of public record, but she had been hoping to keep that part of her past private in her new civilian life. However, with police involved and likely media attention to follow, anonymity was no longer an option. "I served 15 years in the US. Navy," she said simply. "Special operations. I retired 6 months ago and moved to Portland." She didn't elaborate on the specific nature of her service, hoping to provide the minimum information necessary to answer the detective's questions. Detective Santos's expression changed immediately upon hearing this information. Special operations in the Navy could only mean one thing. And suddenly, the scene in the coffee shop made perfect sense. She was looking at one of the most elite warriors in the American military, someone trained to handle much more dangerous situations than 3 street criminals, with knives and a cheap pistol. "Navy SEALs?" Santos asked, her voice carrying new respect. When Sarah nodded confirmation, the detective's understanding of the incident shifted completely. "Well, that explains a lot. These 3 picked the wrong target today." The paramedics who arrived to treat the unconscious criminals were amazed by the precise nature of their injuries. Marcus Webb, the leader, had been knocked unconscious with a blow that caused no permanent damage, but would leave him with a severe headache for days. Tony Rodriguez had several broken ribs and would require hospitalization, but the injuries were clean breaks that would heal properly with treatment. Kevin Chen, the youngest, had been rendered unconscious with a blood choke that left no lasting effects. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing," the lead paramedic commented to Detective Santos. "These are textbook non-lethal takedowns. Professional-level stuff." The medical assessment confirmed what Santos already suspected. They were dealing with someone whose combat skills far exceeded anything these criminals had ever encountered. As news of the incident spread through the Portland Police Department, word reached Captain James Morrison, a former Marine who had served in Afghanistan during the same period as many Navy SEAL operations. He arrived at the scene personally, curious to meet the retired warrior who had single-handedly stopped 3 predators in his city. "Miss Martinez," Captain Morrison said, extending his hand respectfully. "I'm Captain Morrison. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did here today. These men have been targeting women in our city for months, and we've been trying to build a case against them." Sarah shook his hand, recognizing the bearing of a fellow veteran. "I just did what anyone would do to protect an innocent person," she said modestly, though both of them knew that wasn't true. Most civilians would have been helpless against three coordinated predators, and the young college student would likely have become another victim if Sarah hadn't been present. The young woman you saved is Emma Patterson, Morrison continued. She's a student at Portland State, and she's safe because of your actions. Her parents wanted me to convey their gratitude. He paused, studying Sarah's face. I have to ask, were you planning to keep your military background private here in Portland? Sarah nodded, understanding the implications of his question. I was hoping for a quiet civilian life, but I suppose that's not possible anymore. She looked around the coffee shop, knowing that this incident would attract attention she had been hoping to avoid. Captain Morrison's expression was sympathetic but realistic. The media's already picking up the story. Retired Navy SEAL stops armed criminals is going to be front-page news. I'm sorry, but your anonymity is blown. He handed her his business card. If you need anything from the department, extra patrols by your house, help with reporters, anything, you call me directly. As if summoned by their conversation, the first news van pulled up outside the coffee shop. Through the large windows, Sarah could see a reporter and cameraman setting up equipment. Other vehicles followed, and within minutes the street was filled with local media crews all hoping to get the story of the retired female SEAL who had taken down three armed predators. Detective Santos approached with her preliminary report. Ms. Martinez, based on witness statements and physical evidence, this appears to be a clear case of defense of others. You won't be facing any charges, and frankly, the district attorney is pleased that these three are finally off the streets. They've been linked to at least 6 other similar incidents over the past year. The investigation revealed the full scope of the criminals' operation. Marcus Webb, Tony Rodriguez, and Kevin Shen had been working together for over 2 years, targeting young women in coffee shops, shopping centers, and college campuses throughout the Portland area. Their method was always the same. Identify a victim who appeared vulnerable and wealthy, create a situation to make contact, then isolate and assault their target. They had been suspects in multiple cases, but had never been caught in the act until today. Emma Patterson, the young woman Sarah had saved, provided a detailed statement to police about how the men had been watching her before she even entered the coffee shop. She had noticed them following her from her car, but had thought it was coincidence until the confrontation began. Her testimony, combined with security footage from surrounding businesses, painted a clear picture of a premeditated attack that was only stopped by Sarah's intervention. As the day progressed, more details about Sarah's military service began to emerge. Captain Morrison had made some calls to his contacts in the military, and while the specific details of her operations remained classified, her general service record was impressive enough to confirm her status as one of the Navy's most decorated female special operators. The story began spreading beyond local news as national media outlets picked up the account of the retired Navy SEAL who had stopped 3 armed predators. Sarah's phone, which had been blissfully quiet during her months of civilian life, began ringing constantly with interview requests from news organizations across the country. By evening, Sarah was back at her small house in the quiet neighborhood she had chosen for its anonymity and peace. But the street was now lined with news vans and reporters, hoping to get an exclusive interview with the woman who had become an overnight sensation. She closed her curtains and tried to process how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a few hours. Doctor. Rebecca Chan, her therapist, called that evening after seeing the news reports. Sarah, how are you handling all of this? I know this isn't the quiet civilian life you were working toward. Her voice carried genuine concern for her patient's mental health in the wake of both the violence and the sudden media attention. I keep thinking about what would have happened to that young woman if I hadn't been there, Sarah replied, looking out at the circus of media vehicles on her usually peaceful street. I know this complicates my recovery, but I can't regret protecting her. She paused, reflecting on the day's events. Maybe trying to completely separate myself from my past wasn't realistic anyway. The incident at Riverside Coffee had shattered Sarah's carefully constructed anonymous civilian life, but it had also demonstrated something important. The skills and instincts that had made her an effective Navy SEAL weren't just tools of war. They were also instruments of protection for innocent people. Perhaps finding peace didn't require abandoning her warrior identity entirely, but rather finding new ways to use those abilities in service of others. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah realized that her life in Portland would never be the same. The quiet mornings at the coffee shop, the anonymous trips to the bookstore, the simple pleasure of being just another civilian. All of that was gone now. But in its place was the knowledge that she had prevented a terrible crime and possibly saved a young woman's life. The 3 predators who had thought they were hunting easy prey had instead encountered a guardian angel in civilian clothes, someone whose appearance belied the warrior's heart that beat within her chest. Their mistake had not only cost them their freedom, but it also revealed to the world that some people could never truly retire from the mission of protecting others. 3 weeks after the incident at Riverside Coffee, Sarah Martinez found herself sitting in a very different kind of establishment, the boardroom of the Portland Police Department. The media circus had finally died down, but the aftermath of that morning's events had created opportunities she never could have anticipated. Captain Morrison sat across from her, along with Detective Santos and Portland's Police Chief Robert Hayes. "Ms. Martinez," Chief Hayes began, "we have a proposition for you. The incident at the coffee shop has brought attention to a problem we've been struggling with for years. There are predators like Webb, Rodriguez, and Chen operating throughout the Pacific Northwest, and our traditional law enforcement methods aren't adequate to stop them." Sarah listened carefully as the chief explained the situation. Human trafficking networks, organized predator rings, and sophisticated criminal organizations were targeting vulnerable women throughout Oregon and Washington. The criminals were becoming more organized, more careful, and more dangerous. Traditional police work was often too slow and too obvious to catch them in the act. "We'd like you to consider consulting with us," Detective Santos added. "Your background gives you insights into criminal behavior patterns that could help us identify and stop these operations before they claim more victims." She slid a folder across the table containing case files and photographs that painted a disturbing picture of criminal activity throughout the region. As Sarah reviewed the files, she saw patterns that her military training made immediately apparent. These weren't random crimes committed by opportunity. They were coordinated operations by networks of criminals who used military-style tactics and intelligence gathering. The same skills she had used to track terrorist cells overseas could be applied to hunting predators at home. One case in particular caught her attention. A 20-year-old woman named Jessica Chen had disappeared from a shopping mall in Seattle 3 months earlier. The security footage showed 3 men approaching her in the food court, creating a distraction and escorting her away. It was the same pattern Sarah had witnessed at the coffee shop, that this time there had been no one present to intervene. "What happened to Jessica?" Sarah asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "We found her body 2 weeks later," Chief Hayes said grimly. The medical examiner's report indicated she had been held for several days before being killed. "We believe she was intended for human trafficking, but something went wrong." His expression conveyed the weight of cases like this that kept law enforcement officials awake at night. Sarah studied the photographs and incident reports, her trained eye picking up details that might escape civilian investigators. The coordination between the perpetrators, their positioning and timing, the way they had avoided security cameras, it all indicated a level of professional training that worried her deeply. "These aren't street criminals," she said finally. "These are organized operators using military tactics. Someone with serious training is running these networks." She looked up from the files to meet Chief Hayes' eyes. "You're not dealing with random predators anymore. This is warfare conducted against civilian targets." The room fell silent as the implications of her assessment sank in. If criminal organizations were adopting military-style operations, then traditional policing methods would be increasingly ineffective. The criminals would stay one step ahead of investigations, always adapting and evolving their methods to avoid capture. "That's exactly why we need your help," Captain Morrison said. "You understand how these kinds of operations work because you've conducted them yourself, obviously for very different purposes. You can think like they think, anticipate their moves, and help us develop countermeasures." Sarah closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, considering the offer. The quiet civilian life she had been trying to build was already shattered by the media attention following the coffee shop incident. Her face had been on television screens across the country, and her military background was now public knowledge. Anonymity was no longer possible. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that complete separation from her military identity might not be what she truly wanted. The skills and experiences that had defined her for 15 years were part of who she was, and perhaps the answer wasn't to abandon them, but to find new ways to use them in service of protecting innocent people. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Chief Hayes outlined their offer. Sarah would work as a civilian consultant to the Pacific Northwest Law Enforcement Task Force, a joint operation between Oregon, Washington, and federal agencies focused on combating organized criminal networks. She would analyze cases, develop operational strategies, and occasionally provide tactical support in the field when civilian safety required her specialized skills. "The pay would be comparable to what you made as a senior enlisted SEAL," Detective Santos added. "And you'd had the backing of multiple law enforcement agencies. Most importantly, you'd be making a real difference in stopping the kind of predators you encountered at the coffee shop." Sarah thought about Emma Patterson, the young college student whose life had been saved by Sarah's intervention. She thought about Jessica Chen, who hadn't been so fortunate. She thought about all the other potential victims who were currently in danger from criminal networks operating with increasing sophistication and impunity. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "It's not a decision I can make lightly." But even as she spoke, she could feel herself being drawn toward this new mission. The warrior's instinct that had driven her to protect Emma was telling her that this was where she belonged. That evening, Sarah returned to her house to find an unexpected visitor waiting on her front porch. Emma Patterson stood nervously beside the door, holding a bouquet of flowers and what appeared to be a handwritten letter. "Miss Martinez," Emma said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I hope you don't mind me coming here. I got your address from the police and I had to thank you personally for what you did." Tears streamed down her face as she spoke. "Those men were going to hurt me, and you saved my life." Sarah invited the young woman inside, making tea while Emma composed herself enough to explain her visit. The incident at the coffee shop had been traumatic, but Emma had been working with a counselor and was slowly recovering from the fear and shock of her near miss with predators. "I've been thinking about something ever since that day," Emma said, accepting the cup of tea with shaking hands. "How many other women are out there who don't have someone like you to protect them? How many people are suffering because there's no one trained to stop these criminals?" Her words echoed Sarah's own thoughts about the law enforcement offer she was considering. Emma continued, "I've been researching human trafficking and organized crime since the incident, and the statistics are terrifying. Thousands of women disappear every year, and the police can't stop it because these criminals are too organized and too smart." Sarah sat across from the young woman, seeing in her earnest expression the same drive to protect others that had motivated Sarah's own military service. "What are you thinking, Emma?" "I'm changing my major to criminal justice," Emma said firmly. "I want to dedicate my life to stopping people like the ones who targeted me. But I know I can't do it alone, and I know most people don't have the training and skills you have." She paused, gathering courage for what she wanted to say next. "I heard about the police department's offer to you. I hope you'll accept it." That night, after Emma had left, Sarah sat in her living room, thinking about the young woman's words. The incident at the coffee shop had changed both of their lives, but perhaps it had also created an opportunity to prevent future tragedies. Her military service had been about protecting American interests overseas, but this new mission would be about protecting American civilians at home.
She thought about Dr. Watch, a body's
Chen's advice about finding new patterns and routines that would help her transition to civilian life. Perhaps the answer wasn't to abandon her warrior identity, but to find new ways to express it. The skills that had made her an effective SEAL, tactical thinking, threat assessment, combat proficiency, and the ability to remain calm under pressure, were exactly what law enforcement needed to combat sophisticated criminal networks. The next morning, Sarah called Chief Hayes to accept the consulting position. As she hung up the phone, she felt a familiar sense of purpose that had been missing since her retirement from active duty. She was no longer a Navy SEAL, but she was still a guardian, still someone who stood between evil and innocence. 3 months later, Sarah found herself leading a joint law enforcement operation that successfully dismantled a human trafficking network, operating throughout the Pacific Northwest. Using the same analytical skills she had once applied to hunting terrorists, she had identified the criminal organization's patterns, predicted their next moves, and helped coordinate arrests that saved dozens of potential victims. Emma Patterson, true to her word, had changed her major and was now studying criminal justice with plans to join law enforcement after graduation. She and Sarah had developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared experience and commitment to protecting others. The coffee shop incident that had shattered Sarah's quiet civilian life had ultimately led her to a new mission that was both familiar and completely different. She was still a warrior, still someone who fought to protect the innocent, but now her battlefield was closer to home and her enemies were predators who targeted the vulnerable rather than foreign adversaries. As she sat in a new coffee shop across town, reviewing case files and planning operations, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The 3 men who had struck her in the face that morning had discovered the hard way why assaulting a Navy SEAL is fatal, not necessarily to their bodies, but certainly to their criminal careers and their freedom. More importantly, their mistake had revealed to Sarah that retirement from the military didn't have to mean retirement from the mission of protecting others. There would always be predators who targeted the innocent, and there would always be a need for guardians trained to stop them. Sarah Martinez had found her new purpose, and she was just getting started.